Fort Sumter. You would think that the odds of surviving 34 hours of straight bombardment is a very slim to none chance. That is, unless you're at Fort Sumter in 1861, where the number of casualties comes out to a whopping 0. Basically, everyone has taken history class in their life, and usually everybody is familiar with Fort Sumter. And if you're not familiar with Fort Sumter specifically, you've probably heard of the Civil War. So I've always been interested in different places of history. It's always baffled me that all this life and stories lived out. I've been living in South Carolina for the past year, and I've visited Charleston multiple times now, and I've visited Fort Sumter twice. The Battle of Fort Sumter is the most significant battle in the Civil War. So I'm going to tell you why Fort Sumter was built, about the Battle of Fort Sumter, and present-day Fort Sumter after the destruction of the war. So before we get started on what took place at Fort Sumter, let's talk about why it was built and what purpose it served. Fort Sumter is right off the coast of South Carolina and was built to supplement a much older fort in the middle of the Charleston Harbor called Fort Moultrie. The National Park Service Ranger, whose name I actually didn't get when I talked to him, he gave everyone instructions upon what not to touch and a brief introduction on Fort Sumter itself. The fort was one of 42 forts that had been planned to be built right after the War of 1812. The construction of Fort Sumter actually started in 1829, but you're not going to see any brickwork on that for about 10 years. 1840, they started to build the walls up, and it was a five-walled fortification with walls 50 feet high and 5 feet wide. So whenever it was fully armed and manned, it could have 135 cannons and 650 men. But the fort was actually never finished. They were put in commission, so it wasn't an active post. So all they had was 135 guns and 60 men. So now that I've told you about why the fort was built and you know what it looks like now, you can have a better mental image of everything that's going on here. So to start it all out, Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, which set off the secession crisis. When all this happened, the Union took over Fort Sumter, and the Confederates were livid because they saw this as a violation of their rights. The Confederates repeatedly demanded the Union surrender. In the website eyewitnesshistory.com, under the first shot of the Civil War, the surrender of Fort Sumter, 1861, a quote from L.P. Walker as a response to Beauregard was stated, "Do not desire needlessly to bomb Fort Sumter. If Major Anderson will state the time at which, as indicated by him, he will evacuate, and agree in the meantime he will not use his guns against us, unless our soldiers should be employed against Fort Sumter. You are authorized thus to avoid the effusion of blood. If this, or its equivalent, be refused, reduce the fort as your judgment decides would be most practical." So it's widely known that Fort Sumter was the start of the bloodiest war in U.S. history. But even though there was 0 deaths at Fort Sumter, at the end of the Civil War, there's going to be about 620,000. Edmund Ruffin, he's the man who who fired the first shot at Fort Sumter at 4:30 a.m., April 12, 1861. The fort was fired on that day because they had supplies and men that were going to meet them there at noon. So them starting the battle early prevented reinforcements to make it to the fort. After 34 hours, the Union finally surrendered, and the Confederates held Fort Sumter almost to the end of the war. Now that you know what happened here and why this battle was such a pivotal point for our country's history, I can tell you how the fort still stands after all the destruction from the Civil War. Fort Sumter may have turned almost a rebel after 34 hours of battle, but it got much worse through the Civil War as well, almost completely destroying it to no return. There are many wall displays and plaques at the Fort Sumter Visitor Education Center that give you facts, history, and stories. After the war was over, the United States Army tried to rebuild the fort, trying to make it into a military installation. But from 1876 to 1897, it was just used as an unarmed lighthouse, or unmanned lighthouse station. Reconstruction started again in 1898. That was during the start of the Spanish-American War. They built a big concrete blockhouse structure that was right in the center of the fort, and they named it the Battery Huger. But so the Battery Huger never saw any action, so it was deactivated. One year later, in 1948, Fort Sumter became a national monument. It claimed its title, and it's still taken care of and preserved by the National Park Services. You can visit the actual fort today just by going on a short ferry ride, and you start at the Fort Sumter Visitor Education Center, where they have their whole little museum. So when you get into the fort, it's going to be a self-guided tour with a short orientation at the beginning. It's just they're telling you how to help preserve the history along with all sorts of artifacts. So now I've informed you about how Fort Sumter was built, about the battle that took place there, present-day Fort Sumter after construction of the war. At 4:30 a.m., April 12, 1861, the first shot of the Civil War was fired at Fort Sumter, making this the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. The first battle took place for 34 hours with no casualties. The reason I'm telling you about Fort Sumter is because this is the location of one of what may be our country's most pivotal movements.